The Atlantic slave trade. On July 14th, Toronto City Council voted 17-7 in favor of a motion to rename Dundas Street. No new name has been decided on, but the reason for the change was made clear. Dundas is named after Henry Dundas, a leading British parliamentarian and cabinet minister who successfully argued in 1792 against proposed legislation before Parliament in England, a vote which effectively delayed for 15 more years the end of English participation in the trade in enslaved people until the passage of the Abolition Act in 1807. I think it's a great idea. This lecture will try to provide some context and argument to justify spending upwards of $6 million of tax money that for sure could be well spent on any number of other problems and challenges in response to an institution that was abolished a long time ago and that virtually no one today endorses, even those who oppose the renaming of the street. Making that argument for your consideration is one way that we can begin the work of decolonization that David Agnew, the president of Seneca College, has committed us to. The first part of the lecture will describe the broad historical elements, the facts such as they are available to us about the beginning, the expansion, and then the rapid decrease and eventual end of the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. When and where did it start? What was involved? A fantastic educational and intellectual resource is available to us to provide answers to some of these questions. The slavevoyages.org website. All the information that I will be presenting to you in the first half of the lecture is derived from this source, which I urge you to consult and explore. To begin with, we will look at a series of maps produced by David Eltis and David Richardson and reproduced on the website, and some data associated with the maps. The slides that I prepared and used for this recorded lecture have been posted on the Hum 301 Blackboard page lectures folder for week 5, along with a few additional links. I've added a partial bibliography of the sources that I consulted in preparing this lecture to the end of the slide presentation. We need to pause here to raise a very difficult issue, the issue of race, of racism, and of racialization. The enslaved people brought against their will from Africa to be violently forced to work without pay in mines, on farms, as domestic servants, but also as carpenters and as nannies and surrogate mothers, were all individuals. They each had a past of their own, families left behind, lives uprooted and destroyed by their own often violent capture and the atrocious conditions they endured in the ships that carried them from Africa to the Americas. In addition to having individual pasts and pathways, they also, all of them, belonged to families and almost always to larger kinship networks. That is, they came from societies with social and cultural practices, including, crucially, religious beliefs and moral values, and they spoke many different languages. One of the mechanisms through which enslavement became institutionalized was to transform all of these differences into one overriding characteristic, their Blackness. This process is now described by social scientists as racialization. The issue is difficult in different ways. There's a conceptual difficulty involved in coordinating the concepts across the different areas of analysis. There are good reasons to see race operating differently in the legal context than it did in the economic or the political context. But in a different register, there's also a moral difficulty that attaches to the ongoing privileges that are differentially distributed in the world today as a result of these historical developments. Race is not only a category in the social sciences, but racialization is not only a concept in the social sciences. It's also a lived reality whose impact is differentially imposed on different people in different ways. I take these challenges seriously and I call them to your attention. This first map is overlaid with a visual representation of the volume and direction of paths taken by the captives from Africa to their destination. The feature that I think needs stressing is to see the destinations of the enslaved people. As a share of the initial destination of the total number of enslaved people, it may surprise some students and plenty of others also to see that North America represents a small percentage. I'm going to switch for a moment or two to demonstrate the richness of the website and take a look at the way that the differences in the share of enslaved people is visually represented on the map by using the zoom feature. What we're looking at now is a map of the distribution over time of all the slave voyages and the estimated total. And both the embarked and the disembarked totals are represented on this chart, with the light blue representing the embarked and the dark blue representing the disembarked. We'll consider in a second exactly what that means. But if we see, in order to demonstrate a little bit how the website works, we can change several of the different variables. So for example, if someone wanted to know only the Spanish contribution to this, all of these buttons get clicked. And here we see the distribution of enslaved people taken from Africa aboard Spanish ships, and we see that the slide look, or the graph looks very different. Okay, so now I'm going to return to the my PowerPoint presentation. This next slide is a table of the total number of captives organized by the country responsible for the voyages. I want to pause here to highlight a couple of important points. First, the table divides the enslaved people into columns of European countries. This is a simplification that we will not have a chance to look at. It will have to suffice to say that what the columns like France and England and so on indicate are the kingdoms in the course of absolutizing their monarchical regimes at the beginning of this period and consolidating themselves as constitutional democracies by the end of the period that we're looking at, that the ships used by the merchants responsible for the individual voyages were registered in, and therefore whose protection they were at least in principle entitled to. The interaction between the commercial and the political aspects of the trade is one of the central issues I want to raise in these reflections. And so we'll take a look at that in some detail in the slides to come. The second point to notice is that the peak of the transatlantic trade in enslaved people occurred in the last quarter of the 18th century, between 1776 and 1800, down here. 2 million slaves in that last quarter. That's the highest number for any 25-year period covered by the database. These are the very years of the French and American revolutions, crucially important political events related and connected to issues of freedom and democracy in ways that I will discuss a little bit in what follows. Finally, partly to illustrate how the website works, but also that there is in fact an essential interconnection between the commercial and the political, consider and go to the data point I stress is the sudden drop, the connection between the commercial and the political. Consider the sudden drop in 1830 in the number of enslaved people transported by Portuguese ships to Brazil after a fairly steady increase over 350 years, only to pick up again for a few more years. And so we get that here in the Portuguese all of a sudden drops down to that number. This is the same data as so now I want to go back to this chart here. We saw this chart. This is the opening chart, the timeline chart from the database, plotted on the X and Y axis. And so we get this slowly growing and then steady growing, and it peaks right at the end of the 18th century, coinciding with, in ways that we will explore a little bit, the Atlantic revolutions, which signaled the turn to modern forms of governance organized on the basis of civil rights, democratic participation, at least for some part of the population. At the bottom of the timeline, particular historical inflection points are identified in order to call attention to the necessity in understanding what this timeline shows to coordinate the different stages in the development of the size of this trade in enslaved people with historical inflection points. For example, in 1655, England captures Jamaica. In 1697, the French, as part of a broader Treaty of Ryswick, acquire the island of Saint-Domingue, which eventually formed the core of the French trade in sugar. And almost 100 years later, was the first democratic revolution in the Atlantic. It preceded both the American and the French revolutions. I want to turn to look at some detail at a couple of aspects of the data, just to give a feel for this data. If we look at the data for English ships, we see both the number of embarked and disembarked. And what this shows us is the grim result of what is referred to as the Middle Passage. From 1581 to 1875, 275 or so years, British registered ships transported unwilling captured people. Of the estimated 3 million people taken, only 2,733,000 were disembarked. The difference, the mathematical difference between the embarked and the disembarked, represents the number of deaths. So these slaving ships took on a number of enslaved people, crossed the Atlantic to their various ports of destination, and disembarked their cargo, the remaining portion of their cargo that was still alive. And so we see a stark rendering of the terrible consequences that were visited on this so-called cargo, these human beings. Over the course of this slave trade, 500,000 people lost their lives in passage from Africa to the Americas. When we take a look at it in terms of percentages of the total people shipped, we see that the number stabilizes to a cumulative average of a little over 16% death rate. What this stabilization shows, of course, is not an increased concern or an increased investment in the care taken for these people as people. It's an indication of one of the driving dynamics behind this entire enterprise, and that was a concern for commerce. The people who undertook these trips were concerned with one thing primarily, and that is a return on their investment. If we turn to France, we see roughly the same general trajectory, that starting at approximately a 25% death rate, the number stabilizes so that over the whole period, very close to the same percentage is realized over the entirety of this historical development. Because no money was going to be made delivering corpses to the other end of the journey, the people undertaking these voyages sought to the best of their ability to minimize these conditions, subject to the logic of making a profit out of all of this. The point I want to call to your attention here is made by Herbert Klein in his study entitled The Middle Passage. Quote, "The first general conclusion to emerge from a study of all the individual trades is their surprising similarity. The manner of carrying slaves across the Atlantic seems to have been fairly similar across all European trades by the middle decades of the 18th century. All Europeans carried approximately the same number of slaves in the same types of ships and crossed the Atlantic in approximately the same amount of time. They also housed and fed their slave passengers in approximately the same way." He concludes, to continue the quote, "Thus, the many European Atlantic slave trades can be considered as one general European slave trade." The second to last map I want to look at shows the destinations of the enslaving voyages and the proportions of the total trade that they represent. Over the 350 years of the Atlantic trade in enslaved people, the very large majority of the captives were sent to what are now South American and Caribbean countries. What this map allows us to see is that today, 150 years after the end of the internationally sanctioned and actively promoted trade in human beings, the greatest share in the lasting benefits were realized not in the places that the slaves were sent, not by the vast majority of people who lived there then and live there now. Furthermore, we can see that this lion's share benefits was not realized by the people and societies living in the places from which these enslaved people were taken, kidnapped in Africa and sent predominantly to Central and South America, taken from, okay. If we look at a map of today, actually last year, that shows the national per capita GDP of all the countries in the world, we see that the rich countries of today were the organizers of the slave trade as opposed to the suppliers and receivers. The question I'm asking you to ponder is, what connection, if any, is there between the current distribution of wealth in the world and the rise and fall of the Atlantic trade in enslaved people? This is the map of the distribution of GDP in 2020, with the darker shades representing the highest GDP per capita. So the United States, Australia, have among the highest. The Scandinavian nations, Northern European nations have the highest GDP per capita. And we see that the Caribbean and Africa and South and Central America have, relatively speaking, lower GDP per capita. So far, we've very briefly considered a few elements of the European side of this terrible trade. We now look at a few elements of how the enslaved people were deployed in the Americas in order to begin to understand the commercial use that was made of the enslaved people. That is, the labor which they were forced to perform, and how the use of labor changed the trade dynamic as it had previously existed and as it had been previously exploited by the same European powers. This slide, reproduced from a presentation Thomas Piketty, the French economist, had been scheduled to deliver at NYU, but was canceled because of COVID, shows the proportion of enslaved people to the total population of a number of different societies over the period we're looking at. The first thing to consider is the extraordinarily high percentages of the total populations that enslaved people represented in the Caribbean colonies of France and Britain, ranging from 80 to 90%. And so we see here that Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, at the height of their sugar producing years, the population, the percentage of the total population that slaves represented was extraordinarily high. Contrast that with the much lower relative percentage, still a very high percentage in historical terms, of the enslaved population as a function of the southern US in 1800 and in 1860, and the higher percentage in Brazil in 1750, and then later the lower percentage in Brazil at the end of the slave trade when it was finally abolished there. The population ratios provide a material basis to understand just how essential the role of violence was in societies that resorted to the forced labor of enslaved people. Populations with 80 to 90% of the population being enslaved necessarily required, even on islands such as Jamaica and Barbados, islands where that meant there was nowhere to escape ultimately, required of the dominating society to apply and use regularly violence in order to keep the enslaved people on the plantations and to keep them working on those plantations. With this basic outline of a few of the elements of the human dimensions of this part of the human past, we can finally turn to one of the ways that historians have attempted to come to grips with this episode. Does a series of historical accidents explain slavery's reemergence? Or was it determined by systematic analyzable elements? In the rest of the lecture, I will describe these elements and a framework in terms of which these elements can be understood to have operated in at least a roughly systematic manner. The framework has to provide a way of articulating the economic and the political conditions. To start with, following Paul Lovejoy, it will be useful to think of slavery as a mode of production that operates in both economic and political social registers. How does the notion of a mode of production help us? It offers a way to connect the clearly social components of the trade with its clearly economic components in a way that preserves the properly social and the properly economic aspects of the described phenomena. Lovejoy resolves this mode of production idea into three components. First, an integrated system of enslavement. Secondly, the trade in enslaved people. And thirdly, the domestic use of the enslaved people. With some modifications, the rest of the lecture will try to work through these elements and their interrelationships. To that end, I will offer an account of the most recognizably and self-evidently economic aspects of the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, organized in such a way as to allow us to identify possible points of articulation with political and social realities, and then consider a social and political account similarly framed so that the economic dimensions of that account can also be identified. To anticipate, violence and coercion will offer us the connective bridge between the two. Weapons as an object of trade, of exchange, and economic growth, and violence as a vector of power to ensure compliance and obedience and fear. This slide shows the same data as the slide 8 above the graph, but in my view, it's displayed in a way that's better suited to the argument that I'm developing. The trade starts off relatively at a slow pace, that is, the number of enslaved people shipped as a percentage of the total people shipped over the whole course of the enslaved trade starts off slowly, builds up, peaks at the end of the 18th century to dip down to and then finally recede to zero. What explains the growth? The expansion in the uses to which the labor of the enslaved people could be put. The growth of the entire Atlantic commerce was driven by the production of commodities in the Americas, overwhelmingly, but certainly not exclusively, by the labor of enslaved people. And the purpose of the production of these commodities was ultimately for consumption in Europe. This overall transatlantic trade has come to be known as the triangular trade. And its growth and the growth of this trade, keyed by the growth and then the eventual decrease in the volume of trade in enslaved people, coincides not only with the French and American revolutions and the Haitian Revolution, but also with a massive and so far unreversed change in human production on a scale that had never been seen. We see here that the global GDP per capita that had been very stable for almost 2,000 years, around the time of the end of the 18th century, begins to pick up and then accelerates ever more quickly up until the current day. We have a coordination, a correlation between two singular or two important events, and our task is to understand the nature of this correlation. What has come to be known as the triangular trade involved the forced migration of at least 12 million people from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas, compelled under threat and use of violence to work for no pay in the mining of silver and gold and the production of tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice in the Americas, which commodities were then sent to Europe to be sold on the growing consumer market, and even more profitably, to enter into what eventually becomes what we now think of as commodity chains. Sugar from the Caribbean is consumed as sugar, but it's also turned into rum and other spirits. Raw and spun cotton is harvested in the south of the US and shipped to the UK, turned into cloth in the mills of Manchester, and then transported all around the world. The third component The third component involved the shipping of African, I'm messing my slides up, sorry. The third component involved the shipping to Africa of value-added products such as rum, metal goods, cotton textile, and crucially, we'll see guns. The chronology of the development of the trade offers the first articulation between economic and political considerations. Portuguese traders began to navigate along the upper western coast of Africa. And in 1441, the first recorded capture and enslavement of Africans by Europeans is attested. These early voyages drew the Portuguese into an already existing, long-established trans-Saharan commercial network involving enslaved people, but primarily dealing in finished metal goods and gold between sub-Saharan Africa and North African merchants involved in Mediterranean trade. Initially, it was the gold that was sought after, that was the sought after commodity that drew the Portuguese into this trade, and the enslaved people were a secondary consideration. It was the connection to sugar that changed this. Enslaved people as sources of labor turned out to be much more profitable. Initially, the production of sugar using the forced labor of enslaved people was carried out under the control of Portuguese merchants on the islands off the western coast of Africa, centralized eventually in Sao Tome, but eventually established in what is now Brazil. It was in Brazil that sugar production really took off. Portuguese traders bought enslaved people and transported them to the eastern coast of Brazil, where sugar cane turned out to grow especially well. And using the enforced labor of the enslaved people, produced a crop that could then be shipped back to Portugal, at which point it entered into a European commercial circuit to supply an expanding consumer for what was then a luxury good, sugar. For our purposes, that is to indicate that the narrowly economic description of this development is insufficient. Portuguese traders were able to do this only because of the support and indeed the direction of the Portuguese crown and later the Spanish crown. The commercial success of the trade required the political support in the form of naval protection and in the form of expanded infrastructure construction in the Portuguese ports and subsidizing the construction of ports on the West African coast, the staging point for the trade that developed between the Portuguese and the African merchants. This feature of transatlantic trade carried on for its entire duration, and the other great European powers were likewise eventually drawn into the political necessity of provisioning, relatively speaking, expensive ships. A narrowly economic analysis of the expansion and development of the trade solely in terms of prices and production costs fails to account for the full range of historical conditions under which the trade was carried out. The same dynamic intervened in the ensuing years as the Caribbean islands were conquered by European traders and eventually converted into plantations producing sugar, but even more importantly, producing profits. In addition to requiring active and expensive and extensive support from the state in the form of military protection, the rapid expansion of the Portuguese and Brazilian trade in sugar produced by enslaved people also came to depend on a new kind of role for states, and that is using the legislative authority of the crown and its state to pass and adjudicate and enforce laws to protect and encourage the transactions that constitute longer distance trade. The sugar produced by the enslaved people in the reclaimed Brazilian jungles was shipped to Lisbon, where mostly Dutch traders bought it to bring back to Amsterdam from where it was shipped around the world. The military was needed, and eventually parliaments were needed, and eventually courts were needed to manage each stage of this process. The deeper significance of this is to connect the growth of a slave-based mode of production to the significant expansion of the role of the state in the life of European societies in ways that are very broadly understood to have produced our current modern world. The most important economic consequence of the Atlantic triangular trade is almost certainly the diversification of the increasingly commercialized exchanges that came to characterize the European economy. The commodities produced in the slave societies of the Americas were very largely destined to be either sold as consumer goods in what turned out to be an almost limitlessly expanding consumer market, or as inputs into what we now think of as commodity chains, in which profit can be extracted at each stage of the process. This diversification not only generated the profit that eventually financed the Industrial Revolution, but also positioned the societies in which this diversification of production and consumption was taking place to weather the storms that they did not know then, but which 300 years of capitalist production and economic theory have told us are endemic to capitalist-dominated economies, namely bust and boom cycles. Diversified economies not only weather these storms, but in fact are strengthened by their occurrence. And it's other economies, non-diversified economies, which suffer the most damage as a result of the bust and boom cycle of the capitalist economy. The structure of the triangular trade produced the very opposite consequence on the economies of the African continent. Here again, a political dynamic intervenes in a controlling way on the economic forces at work. After about 1650, the demand for labor set into motion by the growth of the Atlantic trade had the effect to increase pressure on societies in Africa to expand their supply of enslaved people. A vicious circle emerged as a consequence of one of the few goods that Europeans produced at that time that were not available locally, namely firearms. Firepower gave the groups of people who managed to acquire them a very great advantage in forcing others to do as they want. That is, in the expansion of enslavement. Added to a situation in which the only growing export market is for enslaved people, the outcome is hardly surprising. The number of enslaved people grew. As Babacar Mbaye put it, the trade brought about enduring insecurities, economic chaos, and political disorders in Africa. It arrested its development by exploiting its technological, agricultural, and cultural skills for the development of the West only. It hampered Africa's mercantilist economy by halting its capacity to be transformed into a capitalist economy. From the perspective of standard mainstream economics, William Darity characterized this contrast as the result of, quote, Differential multiplier effects associated with various sectors of the economy because of variations in backward and forward intersectoral linkages. The long-term advantages of diversification result from the multiplier effects of these intersectoral linkages. That's what diversification is. An example of this process is the rise of Manchester from a minor town to the center of what eventually became the Industrial Revolution. It's in Manchester that textile production was transformed from a very loosely organized home-based cottage production of the different steps required to eventually produce cloth from the wool of the sheep raised in the surrounding local countryside, to the steam-powered mass production for world export of cotton cloth and clothing, on the basis of which capital was generated to fund the Industrial Revolution, which started in England. Manchester grew to a great degree as an unintended consequence of the expansion of nearby Liverpool, the port that eventually became the major shipping hub for the British trade in enslaved people. Liverpool expanded initially to meet the growing demands of the triangular trade we looked at. This expansion required heavily subsidized improvements in the harbor and the docking infrastructure that the ships needed, and it resulted in these intersectoral linkages. The triangular trade brought to Liverpool the raw goods that the coerced, unpaid labor of the enslaved people taken from Africa produced in the Americas. It was the relatively cheap availability of these raw materials that made possible, in part, the development of the industrial production of value-added goods. Expanded trade led to the industrialization of production and the much greater conversion of that production into profits. Capitalism emerges as the systematization of the reinvestment of the profits realized from trade and from industrial production into further production, as opposed to the behavior of elites in Europe and other societies at the time who took this profit and to a much greater degree folded it back into asserting their status as the elites. Most of the profit was spent on the luxury goods by virtue of which they were able to maintain their status and therefore their society in the feudal and tribute modes of production that characterized all other societies in the world prior to the development of capitalism as a dominant mode of production. In his book, Europe and the Americas, State Formation, Capitalism, and Civilizations in Atlantic Modernity, Jeremy Smith describes these connections. Western European states matured capitalist economic forms through the provision of guarantees of property, trade, and credit, through labor laws and the licensing and regulation of slavery, through the British Acts of Enclosure, and ultimately through their own output. They were both encouraged and constrained by the autonomy of capital and of the market economy itself. States, therefore, were not mere appendages of the capitalist economic life. They aided its joint creation and extension with the British state being a leading exemplar. They connected with it as regulators and as political, military, and economic agents. Returning now to Africa, in addition to the impact that these developments had on the economic dimensions of African life, they also had a transformative effect on the development of African society. For this reason, historians have argued that the process of state formation in Africa was profoundly shaped by the expansion of the trade in enslaved people and the introduction of firearms into African society. The increased demand destabilized many of those societies that reorganized themselves to supply this trade. The result was what Martin Klein has called the formation of predatory states. Quote, this thesis links the formation of highly militarized states in West Africa to the increase in demand for slaves after the development of sugar plantations in the West Indies, and sees slave production and the slave trade as crucial to the functioning and reproduction of such states as Oyo, Asante, Futa Jalon, and Segu, end quote. This is another instance of the articulation of economic and political dynamics with long-lasting consequences. Instead of having increasingly regulated and diversified trade produce a consumer market and eventually a bourgeois capitalist economy with the associated increase in gross domestic product, along with increasingly socially broad spread of the benefits of production and trade, the drive to expand the supply of enslaved people, combined with the introduction of firearms as one of the commodities used to exchange, had overall cumulative negative impacts on the development of African societies. Josephine Corey describes it in these terms, quote, the European demand for more and more captives soon gave rise to the formation of groups of bandits all over Western Africa. In places where the foundations already laid had not yet given rise to firmly established large political organization, the process was hijacked by these bandits. Overall, the conditions created by the large-scale demand for captives over a period of more than 300 years severely retarded the long-term process of socio-economic development in Western Africa, end quote. Characterizing the organizers of the trade in enslaved people as bandits, especially in the context of trying to understand the relation between expanded trade in enslaved people and social development, is perhaps not as helpful, or for that matter, accurate as we might hope for. The Guyanese historian and revolutionary Walter Rodney made the important point that the enslavement of Africans was to a very great degree carried out between ethnic and social groups, and that sustained control over the capture and trade in these enslaved people both required and then entrenched a minimal level of stratification, not only within the groups carrying out the raiding, but also among the groups organizing themselves to resist either the always armed European traders or the emerging predatory groups themselves almost always developed out of existing kinship and ethnic ties. In many locations, and Rodney provides the details in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, these so-called bandits become a ruling class and maintain their power using the same tools they developed to capture their victims, violence and terror. We have here another manifestation of the same dynamic above, but this time in its social and political dimension. Economic diversification resulted in the European economy producing multiplier effects that allowed for an ever greater accumulation of wealth, while at the same time, and as a consequence of the very same conditions, the African trading economy found itself increasingly restricted to a single item. In social political terms, the expansion of production for trade, as opposed to production for immediate consumption, which had characterized the European economy since the fall of Rome, was at the very least accompanied by an expansion, a group of people outside the framework of the feudal mode of production, the urban middle class. As the economy grew and the place of trade in the economy became increasingly important, the social role of that middle class, along with the social relations, the habits, the attitudes, and the values that come to characterize them as a distinct social group within their society, especially insofar as these attitudes were consistent with, or maybe even necessary for, the carrying out of trade and commerce, grow in importance. Commerce operates more effectively through cooperation and a commitment to behaviors that are minimally required for a certain form of trust, as opposed to the warrior ethic of the ruling class of feudal Europe. We saw at the beginning of the lecture that the slave trade peaks at the very time in European history when the emerging middle class in England and in France managed to increasingly impose their political control, first over the economy, then over government and society, so that by the end of the slave trade, most of the European states either have constitutional democracies or are in the process of establishing them. It's the very class that organized and initially benefited most from the expansion of the trade in enslaved people that comes to occupy the leading role in the European economy and then the leading role in European politics. Here again, as in the case of the economy, the direction of change in African societies is the opposite. Kwame Nimako has described these opposite trajectories in the following terms. Thus, whereas banditry informed African participation in the, quote, slave trade from the 15th to the 19th centuries, sovereignty and citizenship informed European participation in the slave trade and slavery after 1648. The economic requirements for the expansion and securing of the broader circuits of commodities produced by the labor of enslaved people ended up having virtually diametrically opposite consequences over the long run when Europe and North America are compared to Africa and South American countries and societies. What were the state activities that turned out to be required for the development of capitalism? Jeremy Smith identifies three areas of intervention. Quote, firstly, the passage of laws that created, a level of commercial security necessary to normatively anchor economic action. Second, only centralized states with effective territorial sovereignty could guarantee the legitimacy of the form of currencies, its weights, metals, and divisibility. Finally, Western states legislated to regulate and control labor, limiting some forms of labor, notably coercive ones, whilst encouraging others. It's to the last of these that I will now turn. Smith makes the point that the integration of the products of forced labor of enslaved people, in addition to enabling and being enabled by commercial and legislative efforts, which eventually formed the basis for a full-blown capitalist economy, also had a cultural effect. Quote, it promoted a supervision and discipline of labor that would later suit industrialism. It also boosted the calculative activities of merchants, shippers, insurers, and planters alike. For those involved in plantation, there was a marked desire for greater predictability in production and trade. For example, planters went to great lengths to secure their interests through local legislative and judicial bodies. With that general background now in place, I want to consider the quote from Eric Williams with which the lecture began. Slavery and racism are both tied to capitalism. And since racism and capitalism are both still very much with us, understanding their relationship to each other will allow us to respond to at least some of the challenges of today, not least relating to those of racism and capitalism. The argument is in a sense very straightforward. Human society in 2021 is structured in ways that are demonstrably derived from the integration into the expanding European participation in a globalizing world economy of the Atlantic trade in enslaved people, when it is accurately understood in its full context. I've focused particular attention on the relationship between the rise of and the support for the trade in and the enslavement of human beings on the one hand, and the emergence and early consolidation of capitalism as both an economic and a social dominant feature of nation states in the 19th century. We've looked at some of the ways that the institutionalization of enslavement was an important part of the process that led to the expansion of capitalism as the dominant way that humans currently produce goods and services. Racism, or more precisely, white supremacy, was an important component in the expansion of enslavement, especially as a form of justification for domination on which it depended. Both the institution of slavery and the ideology of racism adapted to the expanding success of capitalist relations. Slavery turned out to be incompatible with capitalism, but white supremacy's effectiveness as a form of domination continued and continues to participate in capital's essential requirement, the extraction of surplus value from labor in order to expand capital. The first premise of the argument is that neither racism nor slavery are natural. It follows from that race-based slavery as the Atlantic slave trade became, cannot be explained solely as a natural consequence of racial hatred. Africans were not enslaved by white people solely as a consequence of a pre-existing hatred of natural in white people at the expense of Black people. Other considerations intervened in order for the development of racism as a cultural practice. At this point, I want to call attention to a terminological distinction that many historians have adopted in examining these phenomena and events, and that I've put into practice already so far, but I want to call attention to it here. I've been talking about the trade in enslaved people rather than the slave trade, and I will continue to talk about enslaved people rather than slaves. They were people first, and they were only slaves as a consequence of the actions other people took. Another distinction that I want to call attention to that is partly terminological, but equally and more fundamentally about the nature of trade and commodities is that there's an absolute distinction between, on the one hand, human beings, and on the other, all the other commodities and services that can be traded. A difference that capitalism historically ignored and that capitalism continues to ignore today. Henry Dundas's career offers a good starting point in trying to understand the sorts of connections we can look to in our search for an understanding of the relationship, if any, between slavery, capitalism, and racism. According to the Wikipedia page, according to Henry Dundas's Wikipedia page, Prime Minister Pitt appointed him Lord of Trade from 1784 to 1786, Secretary of State for the Home Office, President of the Board of Control for Indian Affairs, Secretary of War, and finally, First Lord of the Admiralty. In his career, he brought together the portfolios of trade, of war, of colonies, and of sea transportation, that is, the Admiralty. The point I'd like to stress is not simply the different portfolios, but that these different areas of British life were so central to the British government and Parliament. Parliament's increasing independence from and eventually its predominance over the monarchy was produced, importantly, by its ability to control those very areas of British social reality. Having already articulated the nature of the relation between the rising capitalist mode of production and enslavement as a strategy of labor extraction, how might Dundas's portfolios of war, trade, the colonies and shipping allow us to better understand the way that Blackness and whiteness came to be crucial? First, let's describe slavery itself. Paul Lovejoy, emeritus professor of history at York University and one of the world's leading historians on slavery, and in particular African slavery, has argued that, quote, slavery virtually always has been initiated through violence that reduced the status of a person from a condition of freedom and citizenship to a condition of slavery. Violence and power are essential to enslavement. This is, of course, most readily understandable where the enslaved people are captured, chained, beaten, tortured, starved. One step removed from the immediate application of violence, but still easily recognizable as violence, is the enforced relocation of the enslaved people. Force and violence are often required to compel someone to go somewhere they don't want to go. Force and violence, chains, beatings, punishments are often required to force them to stay in these new locations, and the threat of those punishments scare them from escaping their enforced location there. Tearing a person away from their home community and forcing them to live in a place that is not their own home is, at the very least, arguably, a separate form of violence. Over and over, in a very rich historical archive of narratives of enslaved people, when people tell their own versions of the experience of enslavement, it is these ongoing aspects of their enslavement that are most painful and eloquently recounted. Their longing for home, their grief over the severing of their ties to the people they grew up with, the people they loved, and the familiar surroundings in which they grew up. Anthropologists and sociologists have argued that the consequences of tearing people away from their family, from their friends, often from people who speak the same language as they do, from the form of life to which they had been accustomed in many ways, lasts longer than the lifetime of the enslaved people themselves. The title of a very important and influential book by the Jamaican-born Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson captures this especially well. Slavery and social death. As an institution, slavery requires relations of domination. In this respect, as a source of labor, it is very different from the wage relation. Requiring domination, it therefore produces, expands, adapts, and invents techniques and strategies of domination. Resistance on the part of the enslaved means that this domination must continually be maintained, produced, and reproduced. What Patterson was getting at with his notion of a social death is that enslavement was a process of forcibly extracting people from the network of socially and culturally inherited and sustained interpersonal relationships and kinship relations. The result of enslavement was the production of the powerlessness of the enslaved person. This powerlessness was a consequence of the removal of people from their social environment, what Patterson called, quote, natal alienation. Extracted from a network of social relations through which their social identity was realized, when reinserted into a different society constituted by very different social relations, the enslaved person was, in many ways, effectively socially dead. This account has a very direct bearing on the issue of our responsibility today to change the name of Dundas Street. It follows from the natal alienation, that is, the enforced removal from their social networks, that enslaved people, in addition to being cut off from their brothers and sisters, their mothers and fathers, are cut off from their ancestors and from the rights and obligations that arise from the sense of belonging to a living heritage. A practical example of this has to do with the naming of enslaved people. While it might have been a matter of convenience from the point of view of the masters to impose English or French or Dutch or whatever names on the enslaved people whose lives they controlled as a consequence of their having purchased them, the result is to cut these people off from the names of their ancestors, from the reality of belonging to an historical heritage. An important part of the movement to take down statues, to rename buildings and streets, has to do with the relationship between the past and our ancestors on the one hand, and the obligations we are prepared to accept in the present. In order to make sure that Black Lives Matter in 2021, we need to demonstrate that we know that in the past, in our past, in the Canadian past, Black lives did not matter to the people directing society and to the great majority of the rest of the non-enslaved society. Having argued that enslavement as the violent suppression have historically generated social ties, and that enslavement is institutionalized by imposing structures that prevent the enslaved from integrating the new social structures, we turn now to the question, to what end was the effort to enslave people put? In addition to the violence required to carry it out, the other central component of the institutionalized versions of enslavement is their application to labor. It's through labor that slavery as a form of nearly total domination re-enters into the framework developed so far. Social death, the extraction of people from social relations in terms of which they experience themselves and others, recognize them as humans, was one of the features that made the enslaved Africans even better candidates for insertion into the production process at the other end of the Middle Passage. the mines of South Africa, the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and a bit later, the cotton plantations in the US South, than the ones the Europeans had initially attempted to use. European laborers and indigenous people that were captured on site by the European invaders. As Herbert Klein put it in his 2010 book, The Atlantic Slave Trade, quote, "They found African slaves useful for the very reasons that they were kinless and totally mobile laborers. Indigenous peoples could be exploited systematically, but they could not be moved from their lands on a permanent basis. Being the dominant cultural group, the indigenous people that is, they were also relatively impervious to Spanish and European norms of behavior. The Africans, in contrast, came from multiple linguistic groups and had only the European languages in common, and were therefore forced to adapt themselves to the European norms," end quote. This social death dynamic also features in the work of the French anthropologist Claude Messaillou. It's a crucial part of Messaillou's thesis that the outsider status which constituted their servitude prevented very specifically even the possibility of adapting to European norms as norms. An anthropological perspective allows us to reintegrate the economic and judicial dimensions of slavery into the properly and fully social context without which norms are not even possible. We started from Paul Lovejoy's definition that slavery is the violent removal from a condition of freedom and citizenship to one of bondage, but this account of slavery is too abstract. Patterson's explicitly cultural account reinserts the people who were enslaved in a living historical heritage they brought with them, in which the institutionalization of enslavement demanded be suppressed. The people who were enslaved in this line of thought, the people who were enslaved are seen as having come from established societies and crucially played a role in the economic and cultural life of those societies. The blindness of the enslaving society to the humanity of the enslaved ought not blind us to that reality. In addition to the crucially moral consequences of that blindness, we need to consider that it was only by virtue of that very potential to contribute to the functioning of a society that people enslaved in Africa were forced to migrate in the first place, first to the island plantations controlled by Portuguese merchants, and later to the expanding roster of European merchants and entrepreneurs who found ways to benefit from the unpaid labor of the enslaved. Another crucial point Patterson introduces is that in societies in which enslavement is institutionalized and sustained over ongoing generations, the enslaved people exist in a contradictory status, necessarily marginalized through the mechanisms that produced their social deaths, but just as necessarily included by the work that they did in so many different roles in the society from which they were officially excluded as non-persons. The contradiction between the marginalization that was required to produce the nearly total domination necessary for enslavement and the competences, coordination, and inclusion required to leverage the benefits generated by that domination has an ideological component, and it logically enough calls for an ideological solution: racism. It also has a more easily identifiable and practical component having to do with enslavement as a technique for extracting labor. The first observation to keep in mind is that the use of violence in controlling laborers was not reserved to slaves. In England, from medieval times on until well after the abolition of slavery in the empire, English law in the form of master and servant statutes made it legal for masters to whip their servants for breach of service. It barred servants, it made it illegal for servants to leave their place of employment, and this was backed by the sanction of imprisonment and later deportation to the colonies. The contradiction identified by Patterson between an almost complete marginalization of the person performing the labor and the total integration of the result of that labor into a globalizing economic circuit is better understood as the underlying reality of the operation of the Atlantic economy as it developed over the time period we're looking at. The scale of the expansion of the enslavement of people, the amount of time and effort and resources that were devoted to capture, the exchange, the sale, the transportation of upwards of 11 million humans was only possible because the labor to which they were put was believed by the many people at all levels and stages of that process to reward those engaged in its pursuit. Those rewards, as we have seen, were realized in a broader economic and political context of globalizing commodity production and the political infrastructure which it required. The use and control of labor was an essential. The use and control of labor was an essential aspect of that development. As Douglas Hay and Paul Craven argue in Masters, Servants, and Magistrates in Britain and the Empire, 1562 to 1955, slavery and wage labor, at least from a legal point of view, developed and coexisted as the extremes of a continuum rather than as completely separate forms of social production. It follows from this that controlling labor comes into view as an essential feature of the triangular trade of which enslavement was a central component. The expanded production capacity generated by the labor forcibly extracted from enslaved Africans could only be successfully brought to market in a Europe which was itself under a dramatic transformation, a transformation involving labor and production, resulting in an expansion of consumption sufficient to match the expanded productive capacity. Consumers were needed to buy the sugar, the cotton, the tobacco that was being produced. A consumer needs two things: the need or the desire for the commodity on offer, and the means, that is the money, to match the seller's price. In many places in Europe, from the 16th century onwards, those very transformations were taking place in a process that sociologists have called the proletarianization of the peasantry. This long-term process involved changing peasants legally and by custom tied to the land and working most of the time for the aristocratic landlord and the rest of the time to produce the necessities for their own survival into wage workers forced off the estates that for generations they had been working on for the benefit of the landlord and for their own survival, into the growing cities of Europe available to supply labor for an expanding industrial production, surviving now on their wages to buy what in previous generations they themselves had directly produced. The regulation of this new mode of production also required some combination of violence, legislation, coercion, and convincing. This important component of what eventually becomes the Industrial Revolution occurred first in Britain. With regard to that development, John Donahue writes, quote, employing labor as a useful category of historical analysis reveals that the state found it impossible to begin building its Atlantic empire without laying revolutionary claims to its dominion over the bodies and labor power of the people it governed in Britain and England. The problem of controlling labor was an economic challenge faced by all of the people who invested their money and time in the triangular trade, an economic problem that we saw involved economic solutions, but could not be sufficiently resolved by recourse to the existing economic tools available. In addition to market responses, social, political, legal, and diplomatic tools were relied on where they already existed and developed where they did not. The issue of labor was part of this same set of responses. In looking at the use of labor, we find another instance of the differential consequences of the expansion of the trade in enslaved people in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Eventually, capitalist production relations, characterized by wage labor as the dominant form of work, displaced all other organizational and distributional approaches, with slavery being more or less effectively made illegal, first in Europe, then in Americas, and last in Africa. A record of this convergence between the expansion of the use of enslaved labor in the Americas and wage labor in Europe, specifically as a social control problem, has been identified by Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh. Quote, from the beginning of English colonial expansion in the early 17th century through the metropolitan industrialization of the early 19th century, rulers referred to the Hercules Hydra myth to describe the difficulty of imposing order on increasingly global systems of labor. They variously designated dispossessed commoners, transported felons, indentured servants, religious radicals, pirates, urban laborers, soldiers, sailors, and African slaves as the numerous, ever-changing heads of the monster, end quote. The authors underlined that the appeal to the myth of Hercules and Hydra is no mere ornament. Hercules' solution to the Hydra problem is to kill her by cutting off her many heads. Casting themselves in the role of Hercules, quote, the Hydra myth expressed the fear and justified the use of violence of the ruling classes, helping them to build a new order of conquest and expropriation, of gallows and executioners, of plantations, ships, and factories. In appealing to the myth, the members of the English elite make clear that from their point of view, the nature of the problem is the same, controlling subordinate groups for the purpose of integrating their labor into the growing economy. They also insist on another feature of the myth that brings us to the final set of considerations about the transatlantic trade in enslaved people and its possible significance for us still today. The Hydra quote continues from above. But the heads, though originally brought into productive combination by the Herculean rulers, soon developed amongst themselves new forms of cooperation against these rulers, from mutinies and strikes to riots and insurrections and revolution. Like the commodities they produced, their experience circulated with the planetary currents around the Atlantic, often eastward from American plantations Irish commons and deep sea vessels back the response of the people, and on the other, and undo the metropoles of Europe. We saw how the kinds of labor relations were introduced in response to the economic and political transformations associated with the rise and expansion of the trade in enslaved people from the second half of the 16th century and the rise of a global export-driven capitalism. The final point I want to raise has to do with the response to these developments by the people who had to endure them. Vincent Brown, the Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard, has pushed back against the tendency in the historical literature flowing from Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, which he says ends up suppressing the reality of the social lives of the very people it's trying to rescue from the oblivion of silence. Quote, rather than pathologizing slaves by allowing the condition of social death to stand for the experience of life in slavery, then it might be more helpful to focus on what the enslaved actually made of their situation. Brown focuses on the anthropological richness of the lived experiences of people forced into enslavement, the wide range of strategies that they adopted and adapted to surviving under the brutal regime. To the extent that slavery is accurately captured by its definition as social death, survival itself becomes an act of resistance. The social death of slavery produced by necessity local cultural adaptations to the surroundings and the reality in which enslaved people were reassembled for the purpose of supplying the labor to sustain the life and the lifestyle and the society and the community of the people who bought them. In the North American case in particular, this often involved embracing the Christian religion. Other kinds of resistance also regularly occurred, ranging from doing as little work as possible, to running away, to organized armed rebellions, all the way to the Haitian Revolution. This brings us back to Toronto City Council's decision to rename Dundas Street, and my decision to organize this lecture on events that took place as long ago as the mid-15th century and to a dynamic with global ramifications that, according to many, are still with us today. The students in this course not only come from all around the world in the sense of the place of their birth, but they are taking this course, watching this video scattered around the world. This is globalization in action. Individual students take this course for all kinds of different reasons, and the course is offered for a number of reasons that operate at a different level of organization. This is what history is, the discipline and the reality. The interaction of individuals and their motivations with institutions and forces that are organized, at least to a degree, at a higher level and in response to broader considerations. Toronto City Council's decision to change the name of Dundas Street was taken in the context of the murder of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis and the widespread organized resistance to his murder. In Minneapolis and in cities not only across the United States, but in cities around the world, including right here in Toronto, protesters assembled to resist the murder of George Floyd. The demands for justice in response to this murder were almost always framed as a broader systematic failure of contemporary society, a failure which the protesters tied to a pattern with an essentially historical dimension. At these demonstrations, one of the chants that is regularly shouted by the protesters is "No justice, no peace."